Thank you all for coming here today. We are going to be the continuation of the previous panel on talking about the new normal on the world economy, hopefully the Greek economy too. As opposed to the previous panel, which had mostly industrialists and people involved in enterprise, here we will have 4 representatives of the dismal science, all of us PhD economists, and we will be talking about economic policy that will be appropriate for facing this new normal. So just a little bit to set the stage. You know, once upon a time, we had a world where globalization was ever expanding. We had a rule-based international system. And we had economies, at least in the developing world, that were growing without much volatility, without much inflation, and as a result also with low interest rates. In the last 15 years, things have been a little bit different. So we have had a series of shocks, you know, the great financial crisis of 2007, 2008 onwards. We had, of course, the Eurozone crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, more recently the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and of course the conflict in the Middle East. At about the same time, together with this, we've also seen that this international rule-based order has been sort of falling apart, partly due to increased geopolitical tension, and there was a discussion of that in the previous panel, and it had to do with tensions between the US, among rather the US, Europe, China, Russia, and so on. In addition to this, we also, as a world, face some global challenges, some of which are relatively new, some of which are not so new. So the important one that was mentioned earlier also is climate change. Okay, we are seeing more acutely the aspects of climate change more recently, but this has been something that has been debated for a long time. And of course, this has been leading to us realizing the need for a green transition with all the climate policies that we need to do, which also involves a lot of investment needs, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Digitization and artificial intelligence, it was also mentioned in the previous panel, and of course it's also something that requires a lot of investment, both private and public. Aging populations, ever intensifying, with the problems that this is bringing in terms of dropping the savings that are available in the world, the problems that it's putting on the fiscal systems due to pensions and so on. So here we are in the new normal, and this new normal involves a lot of challenges, both for businesses that were talked about earlier, but also for governments and policymakers. More importantly, also for fiscal policymakers. And here we are today to discuss this with, of course, such a broad topic. We cannot discuss everything, and with you know, the orientation that we have, we are likely to focus on the European Union. And we are very fortunate to have here today some very fine minds and also very fine policymakers. We have Giancarlo Corsetti, professor at the European University Institute. We have Beata Javorcik, who is the chief economist of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and professor at Oxford University. And we have Jeromin Zettelmeyer, who is the director of the Bruegel Institute, or Bruegel rather, only in Brussels. Thank you very much for coming. Let me start with Giancarlo, who is going to give, as I understand, a little bit more, some thoughts about policymaking as they apply especially to the European Union. Go ahead, Giancarlo.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have to say I'm enthusiastic about the Delphi. So let me immediately do a small bridge between business and academics. New normal, when I was in Cambridge, before moving recently to the UI, I had like proximity to the city, and I was an expert witness on a 3 billion trial on derivatives between a bank and a state, and that subject was the new normal. At the time, the new normal was about unconceivable crisis, unconceivable what we call disaster risk, trade risk, something that should not happen in normal times. And the policy perspective there is that when this unconceivable happens, our policy instruments may not work well because they run into constraint, the zero lower bound. And also the policy perspective that we need to be flexible in activating instrument, pushing instrument to areas where, uncharted water, we don't know how really they work, and combine instruments together. The overarching issue at the time was that there is so much uncertainty in the world that people save too much and don't invest. So all this big excess investment will contribute to this downward path, to this reduction in the safe rate, the rate of return that people look for as a flight to quality, to be sure about their life, about their companies, about their pensions. So this idea was that we are in a world where all this uncertainty keep the rates very low. There are controversy. Rogoff has a different idea, his idea about financial innovation. But the point here is that this kind of lingering question, overarching theme, living in a world where there is uncertainty, anxiety, there is no investment, no too much saving, would create this search for safety. So will this be the same world after the inflation crisis will be over, after the geopolitical fracture now will find a new solution? Some people believe that we go into something that is basically the same as before. If you ask Blanchard, if you ask the Feds, they just project rates that are very low. Some people have different views, but Opsfeld remember in his nice paper that even, it's 10 years that people say the world has changed, we'll have a different world that never happened. So this is the jury's out. What I would like to start my new view of the new normal with calling attention to 3 headlines problems, okay? Debt, technology, and demography. This is a world perspective, but those 3 things are especially important for Europe. Of course, debt, technology, and demography result from past policies. So there's been policies that bring us where we are, with higher debt, with the technology gap relative to the US, and maybe a closing technology gap relative to other parts of the world. But even if we want to correct those things, it will take time. Those are not things that we can correct very, very, very quickly. And so that resulted from past gambling. When we had large shocks, we sort of saw, for many years now, we sort of borrow our way out of stabilization. Rightly so, but now we have an issue, which is a high level of leverage, both private and public. There is an issue for Europe especially, technological gap or technological difference. We can discuss whether that is a relevant issue, whether it's more about innovation or more about adoption of innovation that other people can create. Aging has been there before, but now there is a clear awareness that that is a problem. Remember, aging is very much linked to the above, to debt, and to technology. Younger populations are better, not only in innovating, but also in adopting technology. So we even have a short-run example. If you listen to Powell, 2023, a great year for the US, it is hard not to attribute the great year to the US, both to migration, which has been large, and to a pickup in productivity, which everybody suspects has to do with migrants, because they may be younger, more ready to work, more. I mean, we don't know that, right? But it is hard not to see the general picture. So from the EU perspective, this new normal may become an old nightmare, right? I mean, if we don't get these things right, how can we do climate transition, energy transition, geopolitics, defense? There is no way. If we don't think how to deal with debt, technology, and aging in a way that considering the constraint, the slow-moving solution that we can have, can be activated. So let me just give you my 2 cents of wisdom on this thing. What are the assets for Europe we can rely on? The first asset, the forgotten asset, the important asset, is the single market. So the single market was the promise to have scale and competition to bring European to, sort of whatever we like, stability, security, inclusiveness, resilience. It's easier on the single market. The single market perspective is difficult. Okay? Economic policy, not in the single market, but for the single market. How do we do that? Or any kind of activities that we can think, like think about European public goods, European infrastructure. This is the challenge. How do we think of a macroeconomic, financial, regulatory system that sort of integrate into the effective realization of the promise, which is one market, one money. First cent. Second cent, we need policy space. And I'm not talking about fiscal space. I need policy space. We need to have instruments that together have an effect without moving prices, without moving politics against it. Okay? So the policy space I have in mind as a financial, economic, and social dimension. So to me, policy space, especially in the reflection that I had done with the Geneva report, is about changing the paradigm for the idea of substitutability, no? More fiscal, less money. More member state, less common. This is not the way to think. The way to think now is complementarity. Fiscal and monetary and regulation, if they're not complementary, they do not work. If the state-level activities and the macro stance at the macroeconomic level are not consistent, do not work. Things do not work. So let me translate this into a language, right? This is also a language that academics sort of made available to policymakers and policymakers embrace. So this is the old language. The old language talks about global and country-specific shock, demand and supply shock, temporary and persistent shocks. What are the lessons from the recent crisis? That there is actually a lot of problems in the tail risk, in the disaster risk. Shocks can be small or large. Large shocks, by the way, they're not shocks. It is the paucity, the insufficient policy response that make a shock large. They sort of create the. So I'm going quickly to the other language I want to point out. Sectoral, relative price shock. COVID was a big, alarm, a big call for us to think the shocks are not global or not macro, are sectoral and change relative price. This is important because monetary policy with sectoral shock has a problem. So we cannot really think that monetary policy will do all the job. Shocks and policies have supply and demand effect. There is no demand or supply shock. There is no demand or supply policy. If you do income support to people, people work less, so it becomes a supply problem. If you give money to firms or guarantee to firms, do not close down. They keep not only employment supply, but also demand up. Very quickly, all policies will have a huge value at risk element. These things is unknown. We need to little bit of gamble. So we need to think that anything we do, there should be an equity to guarantee it, because they may not go well. Last element, incentives. All policy have an aggregate effect, but also a strong incentive that move the decision to save, work, open a firm, close a firm. Participation in the labor market. Think about the problem we have now to think about, to have a good measure of economic slack. How do we think of policies where we don't know whether there is space for employing resources there? What is the right element? So I leave you with a couple of, with one question and the good news. The one question is, Is heterogeneity, difference across Europe, a problem or an asset? This is a big question for Europe. So if we think that heterogeneity is an asset, we need to think of policy and way to coexist and define policies that sort of work on this heterogeneity, rather than thinking of the heterogeneity as a problem or conflicts that we need to sort of create compromise. No? That is, I don't think, is the way to go. The good news is that we have a lot of data. And we have a lot of data that, especially after COVID, I can give you billions of transaction data in Spain, through which I can tell you what happened 14 weeks after a policy decision of the ECB, very accurately. There are data now on employment, on VAT, on electricity, on everything you think of. And these data are important for a policymaker because, as you know, also with Beata, we're working on something like that. The idea is that we could have, in a period which we don't know what's going on, we could have instruments to sort of, in real time, assess the direction we are going. I stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Giancarlo. Beata, I think
Did I go over time?
Sorry?
I hope that didn't go over time.
you went way over time, my
gosh.
friend.
Sorry.
But I know you for too long to stop you. No, but it's okay. These are all very important issues. But coming on to Beata. Beata, you wanted to tell us a few things about issues that have to do with the geopolitical tensions that we have with China specifically, and that relate with the green transition. So please, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be joining you today. So in my view, the new normal is the world driven by geopolitics, a world where geopolitics trumps economics. And let me focus on one manifestation of that, namely proliferation of export restrictions. As probably most of you know, producing an electric car requires 6 times as much in terms of mineral inputs as production of a traditional car. Graphite is one of the minerals that are needed. Now, what is special about graphite is the fact that 2/3 of global production takes place in China, and that last year China introduced export restrictions on graphite. There are other metals on which China introduced export restrictions last year, and that was gallium and germanium. And China produces more than 90% of those two critical raw materials. Now, these export restrictions were introduced in retaliation for the US CHIPS Act that limits flows of technology to China. Now, in our last transition report at the EBRD, we looked at where global reserves of those critical raw materials are located and who owns them. So we started with data at the mine level. We know where these mines are. We know reserves associated with them. We know who owns these mines. And then we split the world into the West and its allies, defining the allies as countries that voted in a similar manner at the United Nations General Assembly between 2014 and 2021. And then we ask, well, okay, what's the share of reserves of those global critical raw materials owned by the West? And in many cases, the share is quite small. In graphite, it's about 1/3. In rare earth, the powerful magnets that are needed for wind turbines, it's 1/10. So what I am concerned about is that in the last several years, we've seen an increase in export restrictions on those critical raw materials, and that further increase in geopolitical tensions may cut us off from access to what is needed for green transition. Because an export restriction can be introduced at the stroke of a pen, while developing a new mine takes a decade or more. Actually, rare earths are not as rare as you would think. Sweden has significant deposits, but a state-owned Swedish company that's developing them said it would need between 10 and 15 years to do so. So I think it is in our interest in Europe to keep geopolitical tensions under control, to de-escalate, because fragmentation of the global economy is not compatible with the green transition. Now, this is an external threat to green transition. Now, let me move on to an internal threat, namely losing public support for green transition. Last year, we conducted household surveys in 37 countries where we operate and beyond. And we asked people about their views regarding climate change. The good news is that climate change is real. That's what 3/4 of people believe. So the good news is the number of skeptics is relatively limited. The bad news is that when you pose the question as an economic trade-off, should governments prioritize environment over jobs? Or are you willing to pay more taxes so that governments could fight climate change? Then the enthusiasm about supporting climate change disappears. And when you split the respondents into 3 groups, the supporters of green transition, so those who believe climate change is real and are willing to sacrifice some economic outcomes to fight it, into skeptics, so those who live in denial, and into the disengaged, people who believe climate change is real, but they are unwilling to bear the economic cost, what you will see is that in many countries, the disengaged and the skeptics constitute more than 50% of the population. So in other words, these 2 groups can change political discourse in many countries. So the lesson from that is that unless we capture the hearts and minds of those disengaged and convince the skeptics, we are not going to succeed with green transition. Because if there's one thing that my institution learned over the last 30 years of supporting reforms in former socialist countries, it is that unless there is a broad-based public support for reforms, the reforms never last. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Beata. Jeromin, I think also you want to say a few things about EU responses to economic security issues related, but not only to this
Yeah, maybe let me start by making two quick reactions to my esteemed previous speaker, since we usually have little time to react. So I think Giancarlo made a very important point that, you know, periodically we think of a new normal, and normally there is not, okay? So everything that we say in this session needs to be taken with a grain of salt. This said, we can, I think, exposed, identify sort of major structural breaks that really have an impact on economic activity. So, for example, the Great Moderation was such a period, roughly from 1990 to the global financial crisis. I think clearly World War II, with the advent of multilateralism, was such a period. And so I would say that my best guess, and here I agree with Beata, is that when we look back, and we have a little bit of a benefit of hindsight now, we will probably identify such a break either coinciding with the global financial crisis, or maybe a bit later, sort of around 2015, 2016, with the advent of Xi in China and Trump in the United States. So I think the big structural shift here is the Sino-US rivalry that is partly driven by just Chinese economic growth, but partly also driven by increasing authoritarianism and essentially internal problems of both countries, polarization within the United States. And those are fairly slow-moving things, which are probably going to be with us for a decade or two, and in that sense, it's probably justified to speak of a new normal. I have a small side remark, because I noticed there are several either EBRD staff or EBRD alums in this room. The EBRD is an institution that was explicitly created to promote and solidify the old normal, right? It was created in 1990 to essentially institutionally and financially underpin an era of globalization and integration and reunite the world after the Cold War. So it is extremely interesting what this institution, as well as other institutions dedicated to multilateralism, will do about minimizing the damage of fragmentation today. And what we have seen here with my previous speaker is an attempt to do that. I mean, find out what drives fragmentation, how we can minimize it. Now, a few remarks on European economic security, and so here I go into the normative. By the way, I understand there was a session dedicated to this topic yesterday. My colleague Maria de Mercis, who I think is in this room, was there. So I'm hoping we are not overlapping too much. So on economic security, I think from a European perspective, there are two things that people agree with and that I also agree with. One is probably we do need to reluctantly pay more attention to the topic for the reasons that Beata outlined. But on the other hand, we have every incentive to minimize the costs of worrying more about economic security for trade integration and the benefits of multilateral cooperation, particularly because the latter is even more important in the era of climate change, right? So the problem is we're being pushed, in this trade-off between, if you like, growth, efficiency, cooperation on the one hand, security on the other hand, we are being pushed more towards one corner, but at the same time, the trade-off is getting less favorable because actually the value of cooperation is also rising, right? Makes it very difficult. And so we really need to be at the efficient frontier of that trade-off, okay? So that's the first point. Okay, so this is all in the very abstract. So what does it actually mean in practice? Well, what it means is probably encapsulated by Ursula von der Leyen's famous sentence about de-risking, not decoupling, right? The sense that maybe we can reduce risks while maintaining the benefits of trade. The problem with that approach is it's actually very hard to say where one should de-risk. And so the consensus, I think, and the conventional wisdom, particularly on the side of the European Commission, has been to say, look, de-risking has to do with reducing trade dependencies in concentrated areas where our suppliers are concentrated and have market power, and particularly where China essentially runs the show. That is sort of roughly the proximate answer. Now, the problem with that answer is, well, there are many problems. So the first one is it's really, really difficult to identify the trade dependencies that actually would hurt if abused. And it's very difficult for two reasons. It's pretty easy to say, who sends us what and whether they're concentrated. It's much more difficult to then include indirect trade exposures, but it's particularly difficult to actually say something solid about whether cutting off a particular good would hurt us a lot economically or not, right? And we really don't have a sense of how the economy would react, and one of the reasons why we don't have a sense is because, all these dependency measures are constructed on current trade data. But of course, people are going to substitute away from goods and trading relationships if something bad happens. We know that for the most part, the substitution is probably more flexible than what we have in mind. That was the experience in Germany from substituting away from Russian gas. And so we have to take this with a grain of salt. It's not that it's not important. It's just that we may misidentify where the critical dependency is, and as a result, we may incur a cost without actually having a benefit, right? So it's like the typical trade-off between miscrises and the opposite. The second point is we are really blind towards particularly challenges on economic security that do not have to do with the imports. And so the obvious one is export dependency is much less emphasized, presumably because it aligns less with our protectionist instincts, right, to reduce exports rather than to reduce imports. Financial dependencies are much less identified, presumably because we are not really worried about China on financial dependency, but wait for Trump to get back in the White House, we might be a lot worried. And then finally, I think we are very driven by this idea that we are mostly vulnerable to deliberate acts of coercion, for example, restrictions, export restrictions on the Chinese side, right? But of course, there could be another problem with is a more generic splitting apart of the world, whether we promote it or not, for example, due to a geopolitical conflict. So Russia-style interruption of trade relations due to sanctions, and that could be very painful. And then the question is, if you're worried about that, do you want to actually do some preemptive reduction in trade integration? And that is the really hard question, which we haven't really fully gotten our hands around. So overall, European trade integration with China has been increasing quite a bit over the last few years, partly a result of trade diversion after Trump came up with his tariffs. So should we do something to lean against that? It's an open question.
Okay, thank you, Jeromin. I wanted, we've had some three very clear statements on overlapping partly, but also different aspects of this issue that we're looking at today. And I wanted to see in the limited time that we have left here, whether you wanted to comment on some issues that are outside this, but they were actually mentioned also in the previous panel, but are very important for the European Union in terms of doing better in this new normal. So one issue that was mentioned was industrial policy. So industrial policies for green growth, and also the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, of course, is a big point there. And to what extent Europe should be changing its tack on this issue, and whether we economists should be thinking differently in advising policymakers on this. A second issue that, of course, is related that was mentioned is the issue of European competitiveness. And we have, of course, the Draghi Commission preparing a report, so we don't want to outdo him beforehand, but any kind of comments that you would like to give on this would be more very well appreciated. And another one that I throw to your consideration is the financial sector. It's related to the financial dependencies that Jeromin mentioned, but it's also related to issues with the financial architecture that we have now, that we have built after the great financial crisis. So anything on this or anything else that you want that's related? It's a very broad topic, and I think I'll start with Beata on whatever she wants to say.
Well, thank you. First, Jeromin mentioned that
yes, you can say about
that
EBRD.
The EBRD
of course.
was created to solidify the old normal. Yes, that was 1991. But over 30 years, we have reinvented ourselves, and now our priorities include green inclusion and digitalization. So we are actually helping actively our countries to transition to the new normal. And on actually the intersection of aging, which Giancarlo mentioned, and digitalization and competitiveness. What do you, when you ask people whether they shop online, what you see is that there are big differences between countries. You know, in the United Kingdom, more than 90% of people above age of 15 shop online. In Western Balkans, 30%. And even though everybody started shopping more online during COVID, this ranking of countries was preserved. And what is particularly troubling is that when you disaggregate the data in Eastern European countries, you see that older people are very much less likely to shop online. Much smaller percentage of them does so than people above 50 years of age in Western countries. And when you dig deeper into this, it's because they don't have skills. So other data sources, for instance, PISA tests of adult skills, show that in Eastern Europe, older workers lack ICT skills when you compare them to older workers in advanced economies. And this is one area where actually we need active intervention, because as the societies are aging, we need people to work longer. And they will be less able to do so as the technology changes. Unless they have the skills, they won't be able to adjust. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Beata. Let me go back to Jeromin, since he was the last one to speak, and then we'll finish with Giancarlo. Anything that you want to, in some brief comments before.
Okay, quickly on your points on competitiveness and industrial policy. So first, when you talk about competitiveness, be careful what you mean by the word, right? So the word is often abused because countries are treated like firms and countries are not like firms. So countries do not win by having another country lose, in general. right? In this new geopolitics, it can change a little bit. So competitiveness is important, but it should be understood as essentially productivity growth. It is true that on that, we have a problem in Europe. We're less vigorous than the US, and this is particularly the case since the recovery from COVID. And if you look sort of into the deeper causes for that, there are a few things that we can point to fairly easily. So the one is the higher energy costs, and the other one is our imperfect internal market compared to the US. And then there are other things that are much harder to identify, which have to do with business vigor, turnover, competition, entry, and things like that. And the reason why this is a bit of a puzzle is because these are areas that we actually worked on quite hard after the Euro crisis, and yet we don't seem to be quite there.
Right.
So it is a big challenge for policymakers. On industrial policy, so I believe that, of course, industrial policy should be part of the toolbox, but we have to really be careful, well, about unintended consequences, but even before we get there, what we do it for, right? And so there are like 4 things mixed, or 4 possible objectives mixed in right there. So many economists believe that in the presence of a big climate problem, there is a case for an industrial policy that promotes a particular direction of technological change, right? So that is unproblematic. I also think that it is unproblematic to use industrial policy as a tool to address a particular, critical vulnerability. If you really think that we need for example, we need to promote those Swedish rare earths things, that might be a case for a vertical industrial policy. The problem is that very often it's abused for something else, which is as a generic tool of protectionism, and that rarely works, and it's probably a bad idea because it foments fragmentation. Okay. And then, of course, in the European context, it's terrible for the single market, right? One thing I forgot to say at the beginning is that, of course, one argument for the single market in an economic security context is that if we don't exactly know where the next problem is going to come from, right? It's these unquantifiable threats. Then what you need is resilience and flexibility. This was sort of a lesson which we thought we had learned after COVID. We very quickly forgot it again because now everyone thinks it's just about China and Trump, but it may not be. So the single market is important for that reason, and industrial policy at the member state level can really threaten it.
Thank you, Jeromin. Some parting thoughts from Giancarlo, please.
Given 16 seconds, let me give you homework.
You can have a few more seconds.
Let me give you homework.
Yeah.
What will be the economic structure of Europe 10 years from now, 15 years from now? I mean, an aging population means a change in composition of output, much more services than we think. An aging population might create probably innovation, human capital. So to me, it's obvious that we need to think of create financial competitiveness, industrial policy, joint things that increase the level of innovation and productivity growth, without which we will not be able to. Then we can think also about migration, but I think the core of the problem is that we are going to see a big change. In Cambridge, I was friends with Google people. There is a big bunch of Google people who imagine the future, the products on the future. Let's do this homework. What would be 10 years from now the situation of an aging population in Greece, Italy, Germany? What would be the need to create a system where there is enough political support, enough inclusiveness, enough welfare, resilience, prosperity, that after all was the reasons why we are all here with the.
So let's make an appointment 1 year from now in
Delphi
the answer and discuss that, unless we call on the Oracle to answer it before us.
I was inspired by that.
Beata, Giancarlo, Jeromin, thank you very much for coming over here, discussing all these issues with us. Hope to have you with us soon. So let me call upon my colleague George Doukidis to follow on the next panel. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Plutarchos Sakellaris, by the way.